Okay, good afternoon and welcome to Land, Life, and Liberation Part 4. My name is Sally Frater and I am the curator of the Decolonize This Place exhibition, When We Breathe Together at the Art Gallery of Guelph. I'm going to begin our time together with the Art Gallery of Guelph's land acknowledgement. Today, Guelph is home to many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people from across Turtle Island. As we gather together, we would like to acknowledge that the Art Gallery of Guelph resides on the ancestral lands of the Attawandaron people, and more recently, these treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit. We recognize the significance of the Dish with One Spoon covenant to this land and offer our respect to our Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Métis neighbors as we strive to strengthen our relationships with them. We express our gratitude for sharing these lands for our mutual benefit. Although we are convening virtually and might individually be located in different places, it is useful for us all to remember that wherever we are in what we are currently referred to, or what we currently refer to as the Americas, we are on Indigenous land, and that we should move forward in a spirit of mindfulness and reciprocity. Before we begin, I would just like to take a moment to acknowledge the, recent but not new rise of anti-Asian violence that is happening in Canada and the US. And I just wanted to mention Asian Americans Advancing Justice. That organization is offering free bystander intervention training, as is Stop AAPI Hate. And here in Canada, there is Fight COVID Racism. All of these organizations are great resources for information. Before we begin, some brief housekeeping notes. Since we are in a Zoom webinar, everyone's microphones are turned off. You are welcome to submit questions throughout the conversation using the chat function, and we will share them with the participants following the close of the conversation. I'd also like to say a quick thank you to Shauna McCabe and Jenna Brownlow for their technical support for this series. Land, Life, and Liberation is a series of 5 conversations that have been unfolding as an accompaniment to the Decolonize This Place exhibition, When We Breathe Together, which I guess is technically still on at the Art Gallery of Guelph until April 25th, but now it will be accessible mainly via online because of the recent closures which have been mandated by the province of Ontario. The exhibitions and conversations center the Decolonial Operations Manual, which can be downloaded on the websites of Decolonize This Place and the Art Gallery of Guelph as a starting point for reflection and action. The Decolonial Operations Manual embodies the principle of movement-generated media and is a document offered as a tool of study, reflection, and action. The manual is grounded in 5 years of collective thinking, art making, and organizing undertaken by Decolonize This Place with dozens of groups in New York City, Lenape-Hulking, and beyond, with numerous references to movement work preceding the establishment of Decolonize This Place in 2016. The scale, material, quantity, and distribution form of the manual underscores the importance of freely shared printed matter in the work of movement building. Our conversations will explore a number of threads related to the confluence of land, sovereignty, liberation, and resistance. For today's conversation, Decolonize This Place will be joined by Amwam Apka, Latanya Otri, Harry Burke, and yours truly, Sally Frater. Amwam Apka is a professor of drama, social and cultural analysis at NYU Abu Dhabi and is the author of Theater and Post-Colonial Desires from Routledge from 2003. He is the director of film documentaries and a curator of visual and performing arts. Amka has written several articles on representations in Africa and its diasporas, representations and modernisms in theater, post-colonial theater, and Black Atlantic films. Latanya S. Otri has organized exhibitions and programming at the Museum of Contemporary Art Cleveland, Yale University Art Gallery, Art Space New Haven, Mississippi Museum of Art, and other institutions. Through her graduate studies at the University of Delaware, where she is completing her PhD in art history, LaTanya has developed expertise in the art of the United States, photography, and museums. Her dissertation, The Crossroads of Commemoration, Lynching Landscapes in America, which analyzes how individuals and communities memorialize lynching violence in the built environment, concentrates on the interplay of race, representation, memory, and public space. Harry Burke is a British poet, critic, and curator. He was a curator at Artist Space, New York, where he organized a performance and reading program. He collaborated on the exhibition of Ho King Man and Hannie Lippard at Salts, Basel, co-organized with Precious Okuyumon, the Segway reading series in New York City, Poetry as Practice for the New Museum in New York, and Random House for Arcadia Misa in London. He curated exhibitions at the Cell Project Space in London and at the Contemporary Art Center in Vinicius. His writings have appeared in Text zur Kunst, Art in America, Spike Art Quarterly, Moose, and several artist anthologies. Sally Frater is interested in decolonization, space and place, Black and Caribbean diasporas, photography, art of the everyday, and issues of equity and representation in museological spaces. She has curated solo and group exhibitions for institutions such as the Art Gallery of Guelph, Dulwich Museum of Art, the McCall Center for Art and Innovation, the Glassell School of Art at the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, the Justina M. Barnicki Gallery at the University of Toronto, Project Row Houses, and Center 3 for Artistic and Social Practice. She is a member of the Association of Art Museum Curators and is an alumna of Independent Curators International and is currently the executive director of Oakville Galleries. So I am going to turn things over to you, Amin.
Natasha, take it from here.
Hi everyone, sorry I was a few minutes late. I'm in Delhi right now and we have a curfew going on. So there's like a cab rush that happens. So I got really late trying to get to that. But I'm really excited about this conversation and thank you, Harry, LaTanya, and Sally to join us today. This is actually really exciting. And actually, we're a little late on having this conversation specifically around curatorial roles within the movement for liberation within the arts and how that moves on to movement spaces as well. Some of the things that we on our own have been thinking about is how can art be a space for sanctuary and how can art institutions or galleries really work towards that, and something that is within the decolonial, abolitionist, and anti-imperial frameworks. One of the things that we've been struggling with, specifically in the context of art institutions, is that when you have movements like this, and especially this was a struggle with the Whitney Museum, because we kind of went in at the same time when the biennial was opening, right? And when during the biennial, one of the things that we faced was that it was the first time. This is a biennial which is really diverse in terms of people of color, indigenous, Black, brown, queer, trans folks. For the first time, you have more than 50% of the biennial being that. But when it comes around movement lines, right, that almost automatically seems to be like a reverse picket line, like as if we're going, when you start talking about what's happening at the institution, there's often this notion that that the people around the movement side are not seeing how this is also important. And so from our side, I think a lot of times what we've said is there isn't a binary between being inside the institution and outside. We are part of some institution or the other. But one of the things that we're really interested in is like, how do you heighten these contradictions and how do you further push decolonization, abolition frameworks, and how do you actually start thinking about these structures now and not wait for any institution to accept this process, right? Being like, okay, now finally officially we're going on to a decolonial process, versus how can we work on it already, like it's already happening as well. So those are some of the questions I think, and it's not just it's not just a question for curators, but I think this is like as artists, as curators, as art historians, or as academics, or as movement people, who do see who sits on these boards and how these things impact their communities. This is a really urgent question in terms of what are art institutions today, and how can they be actually pushed further to be these spaces of sanctuary. So yeah, that's all I want to say.
And then I can just add just some things to kind of bring into the room. you know, to the extent that Decolonize This Place has done things kind of against museums, but also kind of with museum workers and curators and these kind of things, we've always tried to not acknowledge the inside and outside and see the diversity of tactics and strategies and positions that could be held and the relational organizing that can happen and the type of conversations that can emanate. And I think that we've entered galleries only twice. This is the second time. And the first time we've used it with the intention. So both curators at that moment are with us today. And, you know, we're also happy to kind of think alongside you of like, how do things like this happen? And how can curation and exhibition and whatever kind of be in service of people and struggles and movements versus, you know, people that are in control of these institutions. And I think that's the last point. If people can think about representation and inclusion and assimilation in contrast to kind of liberatory frameworks, liberatory institutions that are kind of on the side of people against fascism, against these kind of things. And if that's just an aspirational thing or there's something really there. So yeah. Excited. Latanya, you take it from here.
Yeah, thank you so much for this invitation to be in discussion. And I've been following, you know, DTP for years. And Kyle, thank you for reaching out to ask me to participate in this. I had the pleasure of working with both Kyle and Vaimoana Numatelo on a show I did last year called Temporary Spaces of Joy and Freedom. And that was a really important show for me. It was really small show, but I actually feel like it was where I started kind of really figuring out some things about myself. And I'll just start with, like, I'm somebody who has this very traditional training in art history. I'm trying to finish a PhD at University of Delaware. It's a very conservative, very white program. I found that I needed a whole lot of other things for the type of work I wanted to do. So I started studying a whole lot of other areas, you know, finding things and doing a lot of Black studies actually in particular, and then later finding the decolonial studies and things like that. And so some of my aspirations originally for curatorial work, and I wasn't actually, I have to admit this for real, being a curator has been kind of like it wasn't the first thing for me going into museums. I was studying the museum. So being in the space was a way for me to unpack and understand how racism operates through the institution. While I was in it, I happened to also get experience to learn how to curate shows. So that's been like a plus point, but it also has come with, like, you know, a lot of emotional baggage being in the heart of the beast. So I've worked in these very white institutions as often the only Black person, always the only Black person, but also almost always the only person of color in these spaces. And it's been really grueling. So Temporary Spaces of Joy and Freedom work with Leanne Batas-Masaki Simpson's scholarship. And it was really wonderful to try to find artists that I thought not just represent, but their practice is doing these kind of things that Leanne talks about, how she's thinking about, you know, decolonial work. That was a joy to work on that show, and I felt like I was really in tandem with the artist. The show I have up now, I have to say, I have to admit, you know, while I like a lot of aspects of it, and I think it's doing some important work, and I want to talk about it more with you, I feel like this is kind of feeling more like a representation show. It feels very different, and it's kind of funny. It was a show I had in mind, but it was maybe my older version of myself that I went back to do this show called Imagine Otherwise. I've been really struggling with it, to tell you the truth. I think a lot of times with different scholars. So I mentioned Leanne. So I've been thinking a lot with Fred Moten's work from the Undercommons, to be in but not of, that concept. I've been trying to think of my role when I was in those institutions as that, like I was trying to, you know, steal from the institution and put the resources in the community where it should be, or with artists, the artists who do the work, not just representations that look like whatever, that can be really beautiful and great, but it had, for me, it's got to be about the practice. I have found though, being the person who's in with no support has been a nightmare. It's very hard. And I had to get out, and I recently finished at MoCA Cleveland. Also, a big idea I've been thinking a lot about is working in collaboration with people who talk about transformation of museums. for me, the transformation involves an abolitionist decolonization kind of perspective. Although a lot of the people who are kind of even saying they're about transformation, they're still talking about reform. And that's been, that's a lot of people in this whole kind of museum field sphere, even though they think they're doing something more, you know, whatever. They think they're being more progressive, but I still find most of them are into this kind of gradual approach and that we're going to fix these places. You're not going to fix them. They're actually working as planned. There's nothing really broken about them. They are what they are. It's hard. I don't know what the answer is. I'm pretty much happy to get out of those institutions and now trying to collaborate with more of the things that I think are on the right, you know, zone and trying to figure out how to put funding there. I'm more about divesting from those other institutions and just putting the money in other spaces and building up more activities.
Thank you. Alam?
Hi, good evening, and thank you for giving me this opportunity to be part of this conversation. You know, let me just come into it from two angles. One, with a story. Last week, I was actually on a panel in Rome where museums are coming to terms in Europe anyway about restitution and returning artifacts, art forms that were stolen from Africa during the colonial times. In fact, the museum in Brussels went as far as authenticating those artifacts by getting Congolese people to videos interspersed with the exhibition to show that, listen, they're okay with it being there and so on. And I keep getting troubled by those invitations because, and I always respond by saying, I'm not going to be the confessors for those museums and so on. And the other point there I always make to them, because they always say, well, Africans cannot actually afford to maintain those. Now, the issue there is, of course, a lot of those works were at different historical moments, motifs there were textual systems, right? There were motifs, and some of them actually, because of the materials that were built in, degeneration is part of the aesthetic, right? So this museum spent a lot of money conserving, preserving, and so on, and thereby taking the discursive essence of most of those works. And I used to say things to them like, if you sold me those works today, I would not buy them. They just don't have, they've lost their significance. In fact, what's going on across Europe now is museums are trying to re-signify those by trying to claim they're liberal, they're talking to Africans, they're considering returning some of them, etc. But I feel that's just a way of augmenting the lost value of those works rather than any liberatory or generosity to the sites they stole them from. And the other part of them, I tell the story of Hector Babenco's famous film, Pichote, where this little street kid from Sao Paulo found these expensive cars parked in his perch. And he started scratching these expensive cars with his coin, and the policeman stopped him. What are you doing? And he just said, what I do with my money is my business. It's a way of telling them that, you know, if you send those works, if the Africans like, they can eat them, they can burn them. They don't, it's not your business what they do, it's theirs. So just return them. So for me, the idea of decolonization also matters, because it matters that it's not imagined as a moment, as an event. It matters that it's really recognized as a permanent process of reinvention, of asking questions about social inequities and adjusting and strategizing against them. It's really supposed to inaugurate counter-hegemonic attitudes with which people produce what I will call like a counter-hegemonic metaphysics, right? It's a way of being in a reality that's so historically staged against the people that are looking at these works and so on, or from whom these works were taken. So for me as a curator, I stage my exhibitions and the exhibition space as a contested space. I don't assume people will come and like the work. I actually want to stage it to show that these works as textual systems are contestatory. And I want to actually encourage the contestatory narrative of place, but also narratives of spaces, so that people are really not just saying, well, this place is great, they're doing more progressive work, etc. But it challenges the historicity of the place. It challenges the selection process. It challenges the hegemonic way with which a textual system and conventions of reading them, art historical approaches are instituted, etc. And so, but it also makes the counterpoint that the assumption that people who are misrepresented in these art forms, in these spaces, in galleries and museums, the assumption that that's enough to traumatize the people, and it's really underestimating the contestatory energy that people live through every day, trying to negate different kinds of domineering ways of being, right? So for me, what happens is that it's a kind of a contested theory of reality, where one is hegemonic and the other is a counter-hegemonic energy that's permanent. And it's always, what it does, it's almost like as a way of seeing, it fragments the meaning that we see. And we create bricolages and we reassemble them and we break them down again. That permanent process of reinvention is what people whose works, or people who are textually summarized and symbolized in museums and galleries and so on, that is what keeps those people actually alive and in a permanent state of decolonization. And in some of those, some of the ethnographic assumption that these art forms actually tell the real story of these peoples, they ignore the various opacities that are included in the cultures of people. You know, it's like the anthropologist or ethnographer assuming just because they interviewed some native people, they gave them all the information, right? And so that kind of assumption, which is so very arrogant, is one of the things that I try to make sure that is staged when sometimes the artists that are put in dialogue, they're contesting the place, they're contesting this, the text, they're producing a counter archive. They say, see what it is, but see us fragment it, see us turn it into bricolage, see us re-energize it. And the reception does not finish in the gallery. Of course, the discursiveness of these textual forms happens outside the gallery. It feeds into social movements. It feeds into ways by which people actually articulate history. So for me, it's important to also stress that for people who are in a permanent state of decolonization, you spend your entire life, your subjectivity, as being in excess of any one place, right? So that there's not enough place to occupy, to corral, and to dominate. And that defiance suggests that these folks whose histories are in excess of the institutions that are trying to tell their stories. And that excess is where the energies of decolonization lies. So for me, the whole conversation is that these institutions exist, they're hegemonic mostly, or sometimes they try to welcome oppositional perspectives only to incorporate them. They're more cosmetic than real. And when they do that, the readership, what people do with the readership, in other words, the discursiveness of the work, is where the real ideas of interpretation happen. Not just in the textual coherence of the work, is the ways of being with this work, where people are expressing a permanent state of becoming, and that those textual forms that simply summarize them at moments of being, right, or even places of belonging, they're saying, no, we're in excess of those ideas and symbolisms of our being, or we're in excess even of the places we belong, right? And that contestatory attitude is what I try to invoke when I even stage the work, and also the kinds of people that are encouraged to engage the work, so that for me, it's a conversation that's endless and open-ended, and that's not it's not based on thesis, but really it begs the questions.
Thank you, Awam. Thank you. Do we have Sally?
I wasn't actually ready to go first. I thought maybe Harry could go.
Yeah. I'm sure Harry's good.
Thank you for having me here today. It's really a pleasure to get to talk to you all. I think so. It was kind of amazing to see the Decolonial Operations Manual, how that shows a timeline of DTP's development over the last 5 years. And it kind of made me think about working with you all at Artist Space in 2016, and actually how that kind of created a shift in my own practice, like a huge one. And actually, like a lot of what after that point, since that point, I've taken a step away from working curatorially in an institution, realizing that a kind of deeper engagement with study and reading and thinking was kind of necessitated in order to like be truly accountable to the kind of work that was being created in these movement spaces. So I'm doing a PhD now in history of art and thinking about decolonial histories and collective formations in contemporary art in Southeast Asia, but also in relation to Black diasporic practices and histories of the plantation. I guess as I've been doing a lot of reading recently, I kind of wanted to just share a few notes from a few texts I've been reading recently, because I thought they tied to the kind of frames and themes that are being discussed in this panel. So the first observation emerges from a racial capitalism in the carceral state reading group that I'm part of, and much love to my comrades in the RCCS working group for providing a generous context for collective study. A couple of weeks ago, Dr. Charisse Burden-Stelly joined our group to talk about modern US racial capitalism, a recent article in the Independent Socialist Magazine monthly review. And in this article, Burden-Stelly, building on the intellectual production of 20th century Black anti-capitalists, theorizes, quote, modern US capitalism as a racially hierarchical political economy constituting war and militarism, imperialist accumulation, expropriation by domination, and labor super exploitation, end quote. So within this political economy, Burden-Stelly identifies the structural location of Blackness, defined as African descendants' relationship to the capitalist mode of production, as a site of an irresolvable contradiction. She writes that, quote, Blackness is a capacious category of surplus value, extraction, that is essential to a range of political and economic functions, including but not limited to accumulation, disaccumulation, debt, and planned obsolescence. At the same time, she notes, Blackness is the quintessential condition of disposability, expendability, and devalorization. So in this analysis, US racial capitalism is rooted in anti-Blackness and anti-radicalism. And for Burden-Stelly, anti-radicalism is, quote, the physical and discursive repression and condemnation of anti-capitalist and or left-leaning ideas, politics, practices, and modes of organizing that are construed as subversive, seditious, and otherwise threatening to capitalist society. These include, but are not limited to, internationalism, anti-imperialism, anti-colonialism, peace activism, and anti-sexism, end quote. So drawing from Burden-Stelly's argument that anti-Blackness and anti-radicalism function as the legitimating architecture of modern US racial capitalism, I've been reflecting on the extent to which these legitimating architectures are reproduced in and by cultural institutions. So despite making space on certain occasions and typically in limited ways for radical art practices to reach a public, many dominant modern institutional forms, from commercial galleries to the nonprofit and philanthropic industrial complexes, nonetheless exist at a nexus of anti-Blackness and anti-radicalism. And I wanted to name this tension because I think it suggests a dialectical relationship that is critical to our discussion. So I'd say that a lot of the most significant aesthetic work today is being done by artists and curators working in the Black radical tradition. When institutions platform this work, the irresolvable contradiction that is internal to US racial capitalism is reproduced. And this is the kind of one of the key contradictions I think has come up already. But yet by addressing this as a dialectical struggle, the Black radical tradition points to methods through which contradictions can be framed as sites at which the conditions of social possibility can be transformed. So because of the irresolvable nature of the contradiction of US racial capitalism, it cannot be accounted for through strategies of representation or inclusion. Broader historical forms and categories must be critiqued. So I think one question that we can discuss today as we consider this critique is what transformations might abolitionist museums and abolitionist universities make possible. And I want to just note at this point that Strike MoMA, initiated by the international imagination of anti-national and anti-imperialist feelings, is posing this question. And Abolition May, a month-long series of actions on campuses across Turtle Island to demand the removal of all campus police, is doing likewise. And Abolition May, for those who haven't heard of it, it begins with a call for a nationwide day of refusal on May 3rd and is organized by Cops Off Campus Coalition, an abolition network to get cops off campuses and cops off the planet. And I'll drop a link in the chat once I've stopped talking. So that's this kind of, that's like a dialectical approach to this contradiction that we're all dealing with in various ways that I think could be helpful to framing kind of the discussion today. And this the second analytic that I want to quickly introduce is that of spatial justice, which is something that I've been discussing in a seminar led by Lisa Lowe. So I must acknowledge my gratitude to Professor Lowe and the discussants in our seminar for the conversations we've been having. And in this seminar, we've been thinking about geography. We recently read writings by two Indigenous scholars, Nachi Blue Band and Mishuana Goman. In her book, Native Colonialism from 2017, Band analyzes, quote, the ongoing and conflicting practices of space making, inhabiting, resulting from colonial processes and the complex modes of presence and prescribed inclusion, end quote. Despite these processes, Indigenous geographies, quote, have quietly overlapped and coexisted in tension with the geographies of the settler colonial state. They have been submerged, but not eliminated, end quote. So Band attends to Indigenous spatial practices to show how they operate as crucial acts of self-determination and cultural continuity and serve as analytics for rejecting native dispossession and the interlocking logic of incorporation within the multicultural nation state. In her book, Mark My Words, Native Women Mapping Our Nations from 2017, Goman emphasizes the role of gender within spatial production, criticizing the heteropatriarchal representation of national space for constricting native mobilities and pathologizing mobile native bodies. And Goman introduces the method of remapping, which she describes as a profound alternative to the unjust spatial imaginary of the global colonial present. But I think that taken together, Band and Goman's texts add to Jolene Rickard's call for visual sovereignty in contemporary art production by contending with the possibility of spatial sovereignty in cultural contexts. And to quickly tie this back to the kind of material, the kind of activities that we're working with today, in MoMA's recent Abolitionist Imaginaries One-Day Symposium, Dylan Rodriguez shared the following words, which have been circulating on social media. I want to be working with you all. I want to be a guest of you all's in an art world which is dancing on the rubble of the anti-Black colonial art world that still remains hegemonic and dominant. So it strikes me as intentional that Rodriguez's choice of metaphor was not only choreographic, but spatial. And Rodriguez's words underscore the argument that radical modes of relation, reciprocity, and recognition require, to again quote Goman, the production of alternative spatialities not mired in individual liberalism. Like this strikes me as important because, again, looking at Strike MoMA, I think that the project constitutes a remapping of modern art's futures and a remapping of MoMA's plazas and the associated sites of imperial and financial extraction surrounding the museum. And so I just want to introduce the thought that given that curators are custodians of spaces, as well as of artworks, I wonder in what ways can the field engage with spatial justice and spatial sovereignty as critical modes of curatorial practice. And I think this is related to this question of how can institutions become places not of curation, but of collective care, which DTP introduced in the Decolonial Operations Manual. So yeah, thank you for listening as I introduce these, and I'm excited to talk more with you all about these ideas.
Thanks, Harry. How are you feeling, Sally?
I'm feeling good. Yeah, so I'm thinking about a lot of the things that the fellow participants have shared today. And I thought I would just talk a little bit before we move on to other topics, to talk a little bit about how I got to this particular place that I'm in right now. And my sort of foray into curating was, it was informed by studying photography in university. And as a student, I was very interested, I was very invested in issues of representation. And I think I was trying to make sense of my experiences of actually being an undergrad student at the University of Guelph, which is where When We Breathe Together is being held on this campus. And I was very intrigued by the medium of photography because it has this very problematic history. It was used as a tool of oppression. But then I was very conversant of the ways in which various marginalized groups have been able to use the medium in order to create their own narratives and to create their own ways of representing themselves to the world at large. And also the ways in which, in many instances, it's a very democratic medium, regardless of people's ability or their financial standing. They have some access to engaging in this medium, either as creators or as viewers. But at any rate, the concerns that I had as a student studying, they shifted into my curatorial practice. And when I first started curating, I was interested in what we would term as issues of identity. I was interested in people sort of articulating where they were located and what they stood in relation to. And that was something that I sort of carried through. But then when I went to study abroad in England, I started thinking more about how I identify and what it meant for me as someone who has several layers of colonization in their lineage to be studying in that space, what it meant for me to actually be having to pay for a visa to study in a country that has plundered so many places where I currently live, where my ancestors are from, etc. And then again, when I was working in the States as a curator, what it meant for me to be in these spaces, what it meant for me to be working in a place like Texas, where I was there as the descendant of people who were enslaved. That is a former slave state, that is indigenous territory, that was a place that was once a part of Mexico. So these were the ways in which I was loosely thinking about place. And I'm just thinking about some of the work that I was doing as a curator. As LaTanya referenced, I was usually either the only Black or the only person of color working in spaces. And that is something that I've been thinking of more recently, what that means in terms of the work that I'm doing as a cultural producer, as an organizer, and working in institutions that where we're not necessarily having discussions about the fact that the field that we work in stems from this history of colonization. It stems from a history of plundering. It stems from a history of misrepresentation. What does that mean then to be inviting racialized practitioners, artists into that space? What does it mean to be bringing their works into collections? What are, as you've referenced, what are my debts to other people when I'm working in that space? And usually what I do is I try to move forward with this sort of mindset of, I got through the door, like who else can I bring with me? And one of the things that I wanted to sort of address at the outset was when I've been working in these spaces, and as LaTanya has mentioned, they do take a toll and they affect your ability to produce work, to work creatively. There are all sorts of things that I think people are alluding to, the ways in which our work gets absorbed or claimed within these institutions, the way in which they are able to leverage and acquire capital, which is based on our labor in ways that don't really acknowledge what the production of that labor means. When I was doing the work in these spaces and sort of not necessarily being able to have that distance to articulate what was happening to me in terms of doing the work that I was doing, I first heard about DTP from the exhibition that Harry did with you all at Artist Space. And I went to a conference in Pittsburgh and someone was wearing a "museums are not neutral" t-shirt, right? And that was when I first learned about the work that LaTanya was doing. And this was something that Mark mentioned in the last discussion. Mark, I am mentioned that when you're doing this kind of work and you get discouraged and you sort of get burnt out, like I wanted to acknowledge that all of you all are producing work that helped to sustain me and helped to motivate me and help me to keep going. And it's been, you know, so it's really, again, I'm very excited to hear about all of the work that you all are doing. But at any rate, at this particular moment, what I will kind of draw attention to was after the events of last summer, not just the pandemic, but particularly the murder of George Floyd and the uprisings that occurred on a global scale, it was very sort of incongruous for me to be witnessing all of this work, or all of these protests, and to see how institutions, many organizations were rushing to issue solidarity statements, but then weren't doing the work of saying, well, how do we perpetuate these behaviors? How are we contributing to this by the way that our institution functions? So spaces that were quick to issue these statements of solidarity about anti-Black racism, but they had no Black people working in their spaces. The ways in which we were quick to kind of abandon the work that we were doing towards recentering indigeneity to be seen as being in support of Black people, not realizing that they can happen in tandem. The silence that a lot of these same institutions are maintaining now when we are seeing rising violence towards Asian American and Asian Canadian people who are working in these institutions, who are amongst our circles, who are in our communities, right? So I think in terms of what I'm doing, I'm kind of like, again, how am I being accountable to this? How is my silence around these things in the spaces that I occupy, how is it contributing to these inequities? What are my responsibilities? And so one of the things that I try to do when I am in institutions, if I'm not in a place where I feel that my voice is being heard, where it's literally being written over or silenced, I can work with artists who share similar politics or similar values, and they can voice some of the things. I can turn over my platform, and that's beneficial to the institution because it's bringing in outside voices and perspectives. It's beneficial to me because of the work that I'm doing is predicated on other people's labor. So how do I give space for those voices and those conversations? But also, this is the way in which you can act as the way in which different people can work as, I guess the terminology we're using now is accomplices. How do we show up as accomplices for each other in order to do this work? And when I was thinking about this conversation, I read an interview with Rolando Vasquez Melkin, and he was speaking about the institution. He was talking about different decolonization, like processes of decolonization that we can do within this work in terms of the language that we use, who we're showing, who we're collecting, how we categorize our systems of categorization of tracking artwork, databases, they're so problematic, right? So he was acknowledging all of these threads, all of these elements that are problematic at their core, but then he put forward the sort of the like metaphor of a DJ using the turntable and how that becomes an instrument. And he was proposing that we can use these spaces as instruments to help us on the path to decolonization. So we can acknowledge all of these fraught histories, but use them as platforms to moving towards spaces of liberation or liberatory context.
Thank you, Sally. That's really great. So we're gonna just try to do another round because this is how the conversation can happen. Things that we say, what they kind of emerge from us. Back to, I think, Tanya.
Yeah, there were so many good things in here. I was like taking all these notes. One of the things I wanted to kind of speak to this kind of, well, it connects with actually everybody, what they were saying, but and going back to Leanne Batas Masaki Simpson, the show I did last year, it's called Temporary Spaces of Joy and Freedom, and it was from a discussion that she had with Dion Brand, and that was a phrase that Leanne said in their discussion. And I just like fell in love with that, the conversation they had, and then I tried to create a show that hopefully felt like a conversation as well. One of the things in there is that Leanne said is how we need to have scaffoldings of care for the people on the front line. She's talking about activists, and I think so often, I mean, I've had artists that will reach out to tell me, you know, we need you to stay in those spaces. We need you to stay in those white museums as a curator, because, you know, that's the only way we're going to get it. We're going to get our work shown, and we need someone who will care for our work and not just be co-opting it and stuff like that. And I said, you know, I hear you, but okay, one, I was here actually just to study the racism of the institution. Mainly, that was the main reason to be in there. And I wasn't really planning to stay in these white museums ever. And that was what gave me power to actually speak in a very, you know, just speak very directly about what's going on. Because it wasn't my goal to move up as a chief curator one day or a director of a white museum. I'm like, no. But I understand, like, from her side in a way, because she's like, it's hard to sell our work. It's hard to, you know, get the right scholarship and have people pay attention. So we need you to stay in that space. And I said, you know, the problem is there ain't nobody over here catching us, you know, so we're getting hit left and right from, you know, these people inside. It's a constant battle, all kinds of stupid stuff that you don't have no idea the layers of foolishness with the writing, the editorial process. They keep sending stuff back, and they've changed all the language, and it's this constant fighting about everything. And that's just like one example. It's about all of the pieces, people who won't, you know, install the work properly, or won't touch certain work because they don't see it as good enough for them. Or, you know, I split up my show and had it so that the current show, so two sites are outside the museum, to force the museum to have to put money into Black cultural spaces, to try to pull money out of, and that's my goal now, trying to figure out how to pull money out of these white institutions. It wasn't nearly enough money, but it was like, you know, I'm trying different things out, almost like experimenting of what to do. But the thing is, nobody is really supporting me in this place. So while I have certain support from people who know museums are not neutral across the country and across the world, but in this city, I have no support. And I've actually had people kind of call me up and go off on me on the phone and everything. It's like, it's horrible. And this is what I'm talking about. So when we build these things, I knew what I was doing. I knew that it was going to create these, as Awam was talking about, these contradictions, or also, and Harry talked about this, right? The contradictions in the work, and how that can create something else. So you know you're doing that, and you know it's going against the thing you're in, that hegemonic structure, but you're going to need some protection. And I kind of felt like, as a strong individual, I could take the hits, but I've been doing it a long time by myself in volatile, horrible spaces. And really, people got my phone number, you guys. They call me up and go off the cuss at me and everything. It is horrific. And we do not right now have enough networks set to support one another through this process. Because really, it's a thing where you have to kind of get in and get out. Like, you have to keep, for me, I mean, I'm like, there's no way I was going to like stay in a white institution for like 30 years or something. But it's like, I'm going to come in here, I'm going to try to do what I can do. How far can I go? How, you know, till I hit this thing where they will not let me go any farther, then I'll flip and I'll just do something else. And then I'll do, you know, keep doing it. But we need to have things that also support one another. We have to realize there is emotional cost to this work. We are draining, like we see that across in many sectors. Other activists are being really hit hard, and you know, Black folks is dying at really high rates. We have hypertension, we're getting this COVID shit. Like, we don't have enough care networks for one another. So that's something I want to stress.
Awam.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think one of the things that for me is to always assume that those institutions they're not church. They're really contact zones. And as contact zones, how you engage it, and the tact, the guile, the various strategies of engaging it matters. They will not give you, they will not be the final arbiters for expressing the politics that you first want to deconstruct and so on. So it's always a paradoxical space. I remember I did something else called, there's an essay called African Colonial Photography and Outlaws of History, where I basically make the same point that photography simplified and flattened Africans, right? It told the story of Africans as simple people, one-dimensional, and they were latecomers into modernity. But when African photographers learned the skills, they got themselves into what you may call the Caliban complex, right? Where they used the skills against the same discourse to begin to tell stories of alternative subjectivities. So they educated themselves in a kind of a deconstructive way to get those tools, reactivate new literacies and new practices that will contest what's already in the museums and in the textbooks. And I think there's that educational mandate for curators, that it's not just in the space, it's really the kinds of discursive spaces that where you can extend the conversations and the issues, etc. The space is not enough to actually express this dynamic history, which I talked about earlier as a history of excess. Right? In other words, it defies simplification in one space. It defies even a textual codification of a people. So the people are in excess even of the code of their representation. And that excess matters in trying to define or produce counter text, etc. It also challenges the idea of just belonging, right? That sometimes the way people talk about belonging, it almost feels like people sprouted from the soil, right? And it's so autochthonous, right? But the point is to really talk about how people contest, they migrate, what constitutes culture is not about just purity, it's about what you become after encounters with others. And there, the theme of equity, of symmetry, etc. matters. And so for me, my exhibitions are obsessed about the histories of asymmetries, both thematically and also in the modes of representation. And they also talk about the kind of contested conventions of rereading these works and so on. So in Italy, I did stuff around this collection of things called blackamoors, which is, and so on. And it's very big, you see them in Italian. In fact, it became the motif for 17th century bourgeois mansions. And you find them in some movies, etc. Some people still own them. But what I did was a show called Resignifications, right? Where we had the show, but we brought artists in residence to contest them. And we posed the question where there are contestatory works riffing off that particular collection. And what happened in the city of Florence was that the mayor of the city, which was weird, wasn't expected, decided to adopt the exhibition to host a conference of culture mayors across Europe to address the question of migration and citizenship and representation and so on. Now, I wasn't expecting that to happen, but that's the nature of institutions, right? They appropriate things strategically. So in other words, if I held on too tightly to that work, I would have been so heartbroken and in despair, but I just moved on to say, well, that's the nature of that space. Otherwise, we would just be in an existential anguish all the time, and it would take us away from the ultimate responsibility of always producing culture that contests asymmetries. And for me, that's just the marker with which I select even the theme of what I do, the places in which I do them, and the way I want audiences to respond to them, etc. And the other point for me is also that there are lots of foundational things that you see. By the way, what I was referring to, that Caliban complex, you all know that idea. It's like, I need to learn the language of the master. So when I insult the master understands it, that I'm not just shouting, right? And so that's, you find that in a lot of Black art forms. You find it because we're socialized in institutions where we are not subjects, but objects of that institution and its history. And so how do we find subjectivity in those spaces, right? Without just going into a state of despair. And so there you really take rigorously the historicity of the conventions of what you're seeing, and also the likelihood of demystifying them and actually repurposing them, etc., to make a statement. So for me, it's that the text, the art form as a text itself should permanently be put in a state of instability, rather than frozen and valorized and canonized, etc. It should constantly be in a state of instability. And in fact, that state of instability is what invites contested interpretations of the work. Rather than put all the bells and whistles and arrest the work in history and so on, and assume it's a representation of culture, it's really to say, no, culture is always contestatory. And cultural practices must also reflect that contestatory energy. And because of that, the texts that we show should also be the contact zones for these contexts or contests of history and subjectivity. And that's why people should use these art forms in a kind of a more decolonizing way, where we also know that decolonization is not just one moment in history, but actually the foundation on which subjectivity is built. It's a permanent state of becoming in which you're constantly reviewing, revising, and encountering asymmetries and adjusting to that.
Thank you. Harry?
Yeah, I'd love to pick up on Latanya's comments on care, because I think this is really important and like deeply, I mean, I think it's deeply felt to many people who've worked with institutions will have felt that sort of sense of isolation and silence. Isolation is only compounded in the time of quarantine and social distancing. So it's something that's happening not just in art and culture institutions, but a broader experience. But I think in my mind, this sort of sense of isolation that needs to be sort of rectified through networks of care is also mirrored by a kind of compartmentalization on the level of discourse on art. And this kind of, you know, the theme of silence that we've raised a few times today, it makes me turn towards a part of the Decolonial Operations Manual, which I highlighted because I thought it was really salient. So I'm going to quote it. It's in the section about the Whitney, and the authors write, "Artists and commentators alike remain silent about the second demand put forth by community groups and co-signed by hundreds of prominent art world figures in an open letter to eject Candace, that the Whitney participate in the formation of Decolonization Commission that would include community stakeholders and be guided by a variety of urgent principles: indigenous land rights and restitution, reparations for enslavement and its legacies, the dismantling of patriarchy, workplace democracy, degentrification, climate justice, and sanctuary from border regimes and state violence generally." The silence around the commission demand raises questions about the role of artists in struggle. And it continues. That I appreciated that because I've been thinking about this kind of dissonance that I've observed over the last few years, in that there's been many activists and organizers who have addressed contemporary art's reproduction of carceral and settler colonial geographies, but their calls to action are often compartmentalized in contemporary art discourse, as if they're distinct from aesthetic criticism. So yeah, it makes me wonder about the ways in which what Edouard Glissant called A Grammar of Liberation and Poetics of Relation can be engaged with through aesthetic discourse, and the ways in which art criticism can be stretched and expanded to think about relation and care, like the aesthetics of care, the aesthetics of building movements together. I think fundamentally the current political economy of art is rooted in a valorization of property and objects, and that there is so much space for this to be challenged and relationships nurtured instead. So I think this ties kind of art criticism to curation into our discussion today as well.
Sally?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, and I really appreciate that Harry continues to return to this idea around care, because that is what the definition of a curator is. You're a steward, right? You extend care to the way that we understand it, care to objects, care to collections. And I'm thinking about this in relation to when we talk about recentering indigeneity, and that often leads to a lot of institutions having a land acknowledgement. So there's that kind of acknowledgement of place, an acknowledgement of space. But I was thinking about how those same spaces that we work in, this is going to some of Latanya's points, we won't necessarily have safe space, like declarations of safe spaces. What does that mean? Who are they safe for? And one of the things that I was thinking about, sort of, again, this is kind of what foregrounds my experience. Like, I was thinking about how those spaces are often not physically safe. Like, how do you exit a space? If we think about the kinds of violences that are erupting in public space, and museums and galleries are public space, how is that a safe, how are these safe spaces for people with disabilities, people who are differently abled, if you need to remove yourself from a space? How are they safe spaces for people who are at different levels of literacy? How are they safe spaces for people who belong to different, I guess, class economies? But I was also thinking about the ways in which, not necessarily to adopt or extract or appropriate indigenous modes of governance, but if we think about reciprocity, what does that mean, right? And this idea of acting as guests and thinking about guests and destabilizing our positions, our relationships, or how we stand in relation to a lot of these spaces. These are things that I've been thinking about and that are circling through my mind again today. And one of the points that Latanya raised in the chat was what is the role of artists, right? And this is not to call out artists, but she was mentioning how a lot of artists are taught, and this is something that I've been thinking about too, when we want to work in certain institutions. What does that mean? What is our investment in those spaces? And as she was saying, who is there to catch curators who are doing this work? And I think this is something, like, I've had conversations with separate artists saying, when I'm in the States and I'm advocating for artist fees for you, that there is a cost for that. And it's directed towards me. I'm the one who pays that cost as the curator in this space. When I am advocating for this, when I am enacting a particular type of care so that you are treated well within this space and you're shielded from some of the politics or some of the violences that exist, the curator is often the one who absorbs it, right? And not the artist. And when we're thinking about one of the things, again, like, I've been following a lot of the actions that DTP has been involved in, and other as well as other activist groups. When the actions around Warren Kander's position on the Whitney board, when they were kind of were calling that out, and a lot of artists, but not all, were withdrawing from participating in that year's Whitney Biennial. And there was Michael Rakowitz, who refused to even entertain the idea of entering into that space. Like, he didn't even offer his work up to be removed because he just refused to engage in that year's biennial. Sort of, again, what are our debts that we have to one another, right? So these are things that I am also thinking about. And also, again, if this idea or these this idea around criticism and writing. How do we respond within with an ethics of care to the objects that are in the possession? So I think of these institutions that are in the collections. If we're showing less than 10% of a collection, how is that acting within an ethos of care? And there was one other thing that I was thinking about, just in terms of it being a sanctuary space. I think one of the things that's really interesting is that we work in a creative field, and that we have the potential, as Alan referenced, for really rhizomatic thinking around all of these issues. They don't have to be fixed. That doesn't have to be a scary place of not being anchored to either a history or a methodology or a practice. But yet we insist on doing things in the same way. This is not how it's done. This is not how we do this. This is not the type of work that we show in these spaces. And I think it's incumbent on all of us, not just, you know, some renegade or however you want to term it, curator, to be invested in that. That's something that your registrar needs to be invested in as well. That is something that we need to really kind of empower our docents. Like, who are we bringing in to kind of interpret the material? These are things that the education department needs to be thinking of. And again, it's sort of like, can we transform the space? Can we transcend the space? But there are things that we can do to trouble the ways in which we do things in these spaces that lead back to, that I think would move them closer to being spaces of sanctuary, spaces where we can hold care for one another. And I think this is just the one last thing I'll say before we move on. I think it's really interesting when we're thinking about, I think there are a couple of things I want to say, because we often speak about, you know, art as institutions and universities as institutions. And for many of us, we work we work in spaces, or we work at spaces who are at the nexus, who are at the intersection of both of these spaces. So what does that mean? But you know what, I kind of lost the thread, so I'm just going to end it there. Just end it there.
Thank you. I think we can, you know, perhaps just bring in a couple of thoughts from experience from like DTP's position and how we're thinking about the same things as part of like generated from what's been said already. And I can just start with a few. You know, a lot of our knowledge comes from doing things and then, you know, having failures and successes and then learning from there, you know, about what to do next. And I think the thing that has carried with us in the work that we've done is us, and I pose this more of like just to kind of inform the conversation. Like for us, we don't really think of ourselves as activists, and the stuff that we do, we don't think of it as protesting, you know. And I think that the reduction of a lot of the work into actions and then documentation is part of like the containment strategies almost, or even the mythology around the Whitney. The Whitney started with organizing on the inside. It didn't start with activists on the outside. You know, that was the calling for that moment. And in fact, if you look at the manual and you remember the history, we were wondering why people were silent. Like, it's one thing to kind of, you know, raise hell from the outside. It's another thing when 120 people put their jobs on the line to say something meaningful about how the institution is not being accountable to its own workers, right? And at the issue with the Whitney was money and funding. So if we're talking about institutions, we're also trying to understand how they're complex and how they rely on money, and whose money, and how does that impact our strategies, our analysis, our whatever. And if curation is about care, it's care for whom? I understand that it's a category of like, that's what you're a steward of something, but if you're getting paid and you have parameters, then ultimately your job of care is for what and for whom? And I doubt it's for movements and for justice. And so you're trying to navigate that stuff, right? So in the process of navigating that stuff, we found, and I say this from a position of like teaching at NYU as an adjunct, like I don't see myself as like an educator as much as I see myself as having a job and trying to engage and study in more of the undercommons kind of way against, with, alongside, underneath, about, whatever, that kind of thing. Now, in the context of the Whitney, again, Natasha alluded to this, and I also want to open it up for a lot of other DTP members to share from this experience, because I think it informed the conversation. Artists were silent. And artists, and there was this thing around, oh, artists are either supposed to withdraw or not. And there's a million other ways of engagement that don't require withdrawal or boycott. But somehow there was this kind of barrier. And I think that this is something that maybe Harry is mentioning, but I've heard it from like Fred Moten and so forth, how deep liberalism runs in our organizing spaces, in our thinking, and how much identity becomes the thing that you fight for. As if like the identity of Blackness in an institution, the identity of Palestinian and representation of Palestinian in an institution, as if we get that, things change. So again, I'm just kind of saying from this vantage point, what we've tried to do with DTP is kind of challenge these binaries and open up space, multiple spaces, and extend the geography outside the walls of the museum, and reject these walls as containments for how we address problems and solutions and build power and unsettle things. And yet, when something happens, people are quick to tell the story that excludes the workers that organize on the inside, that reduces all the work that's being done, the aesthetics, the thinking, the organizing, the care, the generosity, how much time it takes, how much work it takes to do the shit that we do that isn't funded by anyone. This is something that we try to pass on to other people, because if more people think this way, now how does it get kind of distilled? We talk to people about reorientation from the institution to each other. It's not about leaving it or staying. You're always leaving it, right? But you need a lot of people to leave it together. That's the issue of care. But beyond the idea of leaving, how can we unsettle and create more spaces and educate and teach and learn from and fail and do all these things where we recognize an aesthetic? And this is where Strike MoMA is really important. And I'll just end on this point. Yesterday, some of us were in front of MoMA. No one went into MoMA. 2 banners got put up on a monument of a POC person, Jesus Morales, who kind of indigenous, it's almost like granite from the ground, making a sculpture outside, very few changes to it, put 2 banners on it that were beautiful, that were sheer, Amy and Natasha worked on. And several workers from inside came out. One worker works in the archives, another worker works in the library currently, and another person works at the ticket booth. They all had read what got put out on Strike MoMA, and they had printed the terms into their operations room that now hangs right now. And they're in solidarity with what's happening outside of the museum. They didn't email because they were afraid where the email would lead to. But they came out and they met people and they talked. I think that the work that's being done is about how care, in my mind, care is showing up at the institution's door and breaking down that wall and seeing what kind of relations can develop that undermine and challenge and create space. Nit, if you want to go, and then anyone from DTP, and then we'll go another round.
You're on mute, Nit.
I think I just mainly have a question for everyone around aesthetics. That's something that I've been thinking about a lot, in terms of, when you're exiting the institution, or when you are, in any of these frameworks, abolition, decolonization, anti-imperialism, you once again, you have this binary of like, if something is contemporary art or it's under modernity, like, you can, like, there's a certain aesthetics that looks like that, right? And if something is not looking like, modernity or Western contemporary art, and it could be modernity of a different place. It could be Indian modernity, it could be African modernity, it could be, it's not necessarily, there's so many different modernities and each one has its own context. So, it could look different. And so you have that situation. And then there's the other situation of like, oh, if it looks like, it could look very cultural, right? That's the other term that's used, like cultural being, or these are cave paintings from, let's say, Ajanta Ellora, like in South India, or like these are Mughal Empire, like paintings or whatever, right? So there's this kind of separation that's created very immediately. And so I guess the question that I'm going at is like, how has everybody been thinking about aesthetics, especially, with what Avam was saying, and I think Andrew has a similar question, which is when a lot of these things are not meant to stay for a long time, right? A lot of these, as you mentioned, a lot of these aesthetics are not meant to stay for a long time. And another thing, Dylan Rodriguez was brought up. He also, kind of pointed to the fact that, aesthetics of abolition are basically aesthetics of combat, right? Like they are aesthetics of combat. And if we kind of go more into kind of decolonial ways of thinking about it, when you center land, water, and air, in all your practices, it's a different sense of aesthetics, right? So I mean, I feel like this kind of struggle that exists is very much on an aesthetics plane, right? We're sensing, feeling like not cared for, wanting to assimilate into a certain mode of thinking, or like objectifying your own work as an artist just so that it can be part of this kind of institutional framework. So my question is really more around like, how can we liberate aesthetics from a lot of these, different parameters that it has been kind of found itself stuck on, or if there's any reflections or thoughts on it, or any poetry on it, anything. I'm just thinking a lot about aesthetics and thinking about how we can incorporate them even in our kind of actions and everyday life. Yeah, that's it.
Andrew?
Yeah, just adding to what Natasha said about aesthetics, and also what you said, I mean, about the Whitney, the responses around the Whitney. I'm thinking back to the earlier moment when many of us, this is pre-DTP, when many of us worked under the aegis of Guelph, the global ultra luxury faction, and we developed a lot of our tactics in taking on the Guggenheim, specifically over the labor conditions in Abu Dhabi. And we were very careful about, stepping over that inside-outside divide by insisting that we were producing art as part of the actions and the occupations. And it was art of a high standard that we put on the walls. And all of the materials that were produced were supposed to be in sync with the exhibitions that were actually up and running at the time in the Guggenheim. So we were very careful about the aesthetic parallels there, and how we were adding value to these exhibitions in a tongue-in-cheek kind of way. But at the same time, when the work was seized and ultimately we assumed destroyed, we also insisted that was that ran counter to the very ethics of the museum, that they were destroying the art of artists who were part of the community, who were trying to add value. And just the last point there, the artists were not silent around these actions. The art world was very, very vocal, and joined the boycotts, and resonated the messages in all sorts of ways, whether they were appearing under the aegis of the Guggenheim or not. So I think the difference between these institutions to some degree helped explain the different responses, but also we didn't in both cases, we really didn't have curators to work with, sympathetic curators. And in the case of the Guggenheim, we had curators and an administration that was always trying to co-opt us. They generated encouraging responses, but we knew all along that the ultimate effort was to co-opt. So it would have made a big difference in both cases, I think. And we're talking about big museums and not galleries, of course. It would have made a big difference if there had been curators who we could have worked in sync with in both instances.
Anyone else from DTP?
Yeah, I want to make some comments around fugitivity and flight. Just to echo some of what's been said before, like Latanya was talking around like the idea of, you know, being Black and not being able to stick around in white spaces for too long. I totally feel that. Just yesterday, I was like, you know, I did have this dream of being a bartender. I could drop out of it, my PhD. I could drop out of my PhD program at NYU and just be that bartender. Just be, you know, I was literally like having that moment. So there's this like fugitivity and flight that comes from white spaces, or the fear of getting co-opted. You know, museums right now, you know, you're like decolonization, land back, and they're like, did I hear land acknowledgement? Is that what you want? You're like, no, I'd like you to repatriate. They're like, but we're on Lenape land. I said it, you know, and you're like, okay, now we gotta push past that, right? There's always this sense of not being able to hold on to something, even if you nurture it and build it up and do something, because the museum either co-ops it or you lose your mind. So that made me wonder, like, where do we stop for some sense of belonging, you know, thinking of like, what is the opposite of fugitivity? Some sense of belonging. How do we build these kind of care zones or safety zones or comfort zones that folks were talking about? And then I really started thinking about that we're maintaining two spaces. We're maintaining a fugitive space of refusal, but then we're also maintaining a communal space of affirmation, which is an abolitionist problem to have, right? Thinking of both the yes and the no, the refusal and the affirmation. And then lastly, I was just thinking of, you know, it's really hard to keep those two spaces separate, even mentally. They're two separate ways of relating, two ways of being in the world. And it made me think of what happens when we become, you know, kind of fond of being fugitives, or the ways that, like, you know, when I'm in white spaces, I'm very just like on edge. I'm very like, you know, don't come for me unless I have sent for you. I'm very like, you know, yeah, like paranoid almost, even like who's coming at me, why are they coming at me? And then you go into like a communal space and you have to kind of like relax your shoulders. You kind of have to like, it's a whole new mode of being. And a lot of it comes with trauma and being in white spaces. And then we bring that over in those ways of being into our Black communal spaces, or our POC, or our women, or queer spaces. So yeah, you know, how do we bring that fugitivity and that flightiness and that kind of on edginess and that like third eye open at all times into communal spaces? And, you know, how do we navigate that in our movements? Those are some of the thoughts I was having.
Anyone else from DTP before we go back to Latanya?
Yeah, before we go, well, actually, I was going to direct a question to Latanya, just in terms of like thinking about what Mars was just describing and discussing. Maybe you could talk a little bit, Latanya, about the Black Liberation Center that you're building within MoCA Cleveland, but also extracting it with you when you leave.
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, I came up with this project, Black Liberation Center, last summer. You know, I was like, this place is just insane. It's really bad, hurtful place. And so I decided I was there under a fellowship, a curatorial fellowship, and I restructured that fellowship into a residency, because I was just like, the people who are supposed to be my supervisors are incompetent and racist. And, you know, the racism is not a surprise. I've experienced that at every white museum I've worked at, but the degree of incompetence was a little like, whoa, it's really bad here. So yeah, I restructured my fellowship and made it into a residency, and I proposed that I would do this project, Black Liberation Center project, while I was there. So I would stop actually reporting to the institution as like a regular staff member. I was like, no, I don't report to this person anymore. I just have a project, like an artist coming in with a project they're going to work on, and mine would be this Liberation Center. And it was a series of programming, and it did like a teach-in last December, yeah, December, we did a big teach-in. And, you know, thinking about the care, like, yes, I was trained to do this kind of focus on care for objects through this art history training, you know. And like I said, I was more just kind of trying to understand a museum and using a critical race theory lens, applying that to museums as institutions. But yes, in this very traditional white art history program, the idea of curating was like, yeah, we're taking care of objects. I started thinking, like, in the process while getting all this training in these places, that, you know, it was leaving out, and sometimes they'll talk about caring for the artist, sometimes, you know, like contemporary institutions will pretend to do that, maybe. But I started thinking I needed to be working with my community more, which has really nothing to do with this place. So I started thinking how to work, again, breaking past that idea of the inside outside, but just always working with my people. I come from working class background. I'm a, you know, descendant of enslaved people. I'm thinking about the people who are typically pushed out of these institutions. How do I continue to work with them? So Black Liberation Center, I was thinking, like, here at MoCA Cleveland, they just did some really horrible stuff to Miss Samaria Rice, the mother of Tamir Rice, last summer. It was just, it was just embarrassing to know I worked at such an institution that would treat this woman like garbage. I reached out to her, you know, with this email address from this institution, and I didn't know she was going to respond, but, you know, I was like, I'm just going to write to her and try to see what I can, you know, say, and what can I do. We ended up collaborating. She did respond back and said she almost didn't open it when she saw that address, but she did open it because we had met one time previously, separately. So she opened the email, we started talking. She ended up participating in this teach-in that I did. It was pretty fantastic. It was showing me other ways to operate. And again, pulling money from this, like trying to, in a way, you know, but this is the thing, again, about how the institution then co-ops the work. So then they're like, oh, that they did it, and then they didn't. It was me who worked with her after they had already insulted her, treated her really badly. I was able to draw funds from the institution and then give to her so she could do what she needs for her work as an activist. It has been hard, but I do think the Black Liberation Center for me has been my future. I called it a maroon society that I created for myself in this white institution, a way to save my life and continue to adhere to my own beliefs, my own ethics, and beliefs in anti-racism work. And yeah, the project is something I'm continuing on. Like, I finished up at MoCA Cleveland on the March 31st, and Liberation Center, I hope to have that keep going. It's working with ideas of Audre Lorde, and, you know, it's just a thing that I care about a lot. It's just a way to make an art center and getting away from those spaces. I do think it's something that can collaborate with, you know, other organizations, artists, maybe institutions. It depends on the place, you know, just finding people with the right kind of politics, with the liberatory kind of focus.
Thank you. Maybe kind of recalling Natasha's question and Harry's questions, but thinking about aesthetics as like one of the things to think about. And you know, I think in relation to that funding, but they're also separate, thinking about money. Awam, if you want to.
Yeah, look, first of all, I'm just lucky. I teach, and my curatorial practice is part of my work as a scholar. And I came from a theater performance background where staging was very important to me. So that's why the energies into staging the curatorial work in visual art matters to me as well. But I mean, let's not, forget that these museums or institutions, they are places that produce orthodoxies of presentation, orthodoxies of interpretation, and they want to socialize or assimilate people into those orthodoxies. And even artists look at those orthodoxies and try to reef off and produce work that could make them legible in those spaces as well. So that's what those institutions are there for. And there shouldn't be any kind of illusion that they're suddenly going to be revolutionary spots. But then once in a while, there are that loose moments where they don't even have projects that are that constantly coherent. Once in a while, they'll just open things up. And it sometimes spirals out of control from them, and then they recoil and reappropriate them and so on. So they have their good liberatory people and they have their bad liberatory people. They just look through the Rolodex and so on. And I guess for me, being lucky enough to teach in a university where, my colleague Deb Willis and I do this big thing called Black Portraiture, where we bring scholars and artists together. We travel to different parts of the world actually to engage this subject, etc. So this is kind of our space of dealing with all of these questions as they emerge. And I think what, I'm not sure, it might be Krista or Maz mentioned earlier, it's really just a description of what coloniality means, right? So imagine people for whom the borders of history crosses them, where even their ways of thinking, speaking, and imagining or being in the world is already predetermined by the very language and discourse that objectifies them. So you're put into that, what Frantz Fanon called a permanent state of nervous condition, right? And that's why, and it can do two things. It can just make you freak out and be in a state of despair, or it forces you, you have no space for being neutral. I mean, even people who are conservative, they immediately are reminded of the place of belonging, right? So like the idea of a Black conservative, yes, they very much go through a process. I remember that image of Alan Keyes being arrested for protesting, not being in the Republican debate. Yeah, he was arrested and he was maltreated as any other Black man who was being, quote unquote, disruptive in a television station because the Republicans didn't want him to be a candidate and so on. So even he learned so soon that the honorary space he had in that circle was really a temporary one. So the point then becomes that how do we not get carried away by moments where we get recognition and forget the responsibilities of the places we came from? And I think that is a common occurrence where you can easily do that. So for me, I feel for curators who professionally they have to work in these institutions and they're put in this permanent state of nervous condition where they don't want to appear to be too disruptive. They have to be acceptably good citizens of that space. And when occasionally permitted to take into those discursive riches of doing more important community work, it's just a little license to do that. So I understand the limitations that are imposed with those institutions that I work in. For me, because it's not my day job, I'm able to just go into those spaces and engage with those spaces. But I also, in my case, I start out with the artists, not with the institutions. So there are artists whose works I like, whose they fit into what I'm trying to do, and I put it in that space rather than working for an institution. I don't work for NYU's museum, whatever it is, or wherever it is. So I don't work for that. So for me, it's just I walk in 2 departments in New York and here, and that's what I do. I just tell stories and engage audiences in those spaces with the kind of themes that I want to do. But the aesthetic issue then becomes critical. So there's no aesthetic that is permanent. Situation is situational ethics, right? And in most cases, even when those aesthetics start out being quite radical and so on, they can easily be incorporated to become passive objects in those spaces and so on. So it's really the moment in history when social inequities are being questioned and addressed, and the textuality of these art forms at that moment that really is much more interesting than a universal historicity to the aesthetic itself. Because so for me, the aesthetics of the work is really, really like what Andrew was describing, in that it was so situational, right? And it had its moment. Even when it was destroyed, the memory of the text participates in what was going on and so on. If those works were suddenly bought and put inside, they've lost their significance and so on. So the moment of signification is more, for me, that what will determine the significance of the aesthetics. And for me, if it's kind of a liberatory moment, that's great. But the coloniality of our everyday life is also an important point to make. And I think that was a point being made earlier, that in that coloniality of everyday life, how do we create spaces of decolonization, right? How do we create the language and conventions, ways of seeing and being that actually constantly limits the dominance of the coloniality of everyday life? And I think for me, that's the bigger theme of that makes our work important, right? That as curators or as artists, it's just the fact that we're contesting or contending with the coloniality of everyday life, and who speaks for whom, and the legibility of what we do, what conventions of representations do we deploy to do them, and where do they perform them, and so on, and what kinds of discursive groups do we use them to motivate to deal with social inequalities. For me, those big questions will determine what makes good art, what makes good spaces to present those work, and what makes even the catalog that you produce for those audiences.
Harry?
This is really beautiful. I'm really enjoying how themes are building and in the exchanges between people. And I just like hearing Mars really thinking about how healing is really important in dealing with these spaces that have been traumatizing spaces for so many people. I think I want to pick up on Natasha and Andrew's points about multiple modernities, and the question that Andrew dropped in the chat. I think this is a critical point because actually it really speaks, and this, this ties to money and to financialization, because it really speaks to the way in which there's a growth mindset that's endemic to cultural institutions. It seems like almost all museums and even nonprofit spaces have to grow in order to be relevant. And this is tied to this notion of multiple modernities, because as museums like MoMA expand and diversify their collections, they kind of tie this to their ongoing growth and expansion. And so the recent rehang a couple of years ago, for example, involved a expansion of their footprint, a development of the real estate of the museum. So of course, this necessitates financial growth and a continuing dependency on philanthropy and financialization. And against that paradigm, I think I really want to see degrowth. And I think degrowth could involve the rematriation of objects, equity in living wages for staff, redistribution of resources and platforms, provincialization and therefore de-universalization of the modern museum, and other strategies. So kind of in answer to Andrew's question of how can curators balance between different obligations to multiple modernities, I think that degrowth is one strategy that this can happen. And degrowth requires accountability to communities rather than privileging the taste and aesthetics of donors. Multi-million-dollar climate-controlled artworks are an extension of the climate chaos that is driving people away from their homes and lands. So degrowth addresses a kind of issues of climate justice. And I want to shout out to Hilman and Rifki from Kunci Study Forum and Collective in Yogyakarta, Indonesia, who I see in the audience. I know it's very late there, so it's amazing you're joining us. And their work in Jogja and the other collectives and groups in Indonesia, Southeast Asia, elsewhere, are examples where these questions of cultural preservation and liberation are being addressed in ways that decenter European colonial frames. So I see this work being done, and I think that degrowth and abolitionist museums can be platforms where connections can be made between abolition and land back movements in Turtle Island, with archipelagos of collective study and art making elsewhere in the decolonizing South. So I think, you know, this is a manner in which we can re-enchant curatorial work in really creative and liberatory ways. So yeah, I see that as one exciting kind of front for cultural work, and a kind of integration of aesthetics in our organizing and relationship building.
Sally?
Yeah, so there were a couple of things that have been floating through my mind, and one of the points that I actually want to go back to was something that Natasha mentioned in her introductory remarks, where we're at this moment, and I guess we've been at these moments for, I think, the past 40 years, where the platform for who we hear from, whose voices are being represented, is expanding at moments when there are calls to kind of turn out, to invert these spaces, these types of spaces, whether it's the institution of the museum or the university, or even the healthcare system, right? And so at a moment when, you know, there is more representation in terms of racialized and indigenous curators in these spaces, and more of a consideration of how different museological spaces operate throughout the world, beyond the US, beyond Europe. What this means, we're talking about dismantling them. So it's interesting, and that's kind of a tension that I, for one, as a cultural practitioner, that's something I need to navigate with, I need to contend with. In terms of aesthetics, for me personally, I'm someone who started working in artist-run centers and then went on to work in university museums and kind of shifted back and forth between the two. So my aesthetics, in terms of my taste, what I show, etc., it's informed by those spaces. So by the same token, it's like I can ask someone who's a more established artist, who the way that we understand moving through these systems, it's that you progress. You start out in artist-run spaces, then you go to maybe municipal museums, then you go to these national institutions and on a global scale. Someone who's showing, say, at a MoMA or a Whitney, they're not going to be interested. That's what we understand. They're not going to be interested in having a certain type of conversation or presentation in a different type of space. Well, why can't we invite those people to show in those spaces? Why can't we invite them to meet us there? Why can't curators go to meet people in those spaces? And the inverse of that is people who are used to showing in those spaces, who produce the types of aesthetics that show in those spaces, why can't we show them in larger institutions, right? So that's something that I'm thinking about in terms of aesthetics, et cetera. But then also these aesthetics around modernity, it's interesting because the way that we understand modernity, that's something that's kind of infiltrated many different audiences, many different intellectuals, many different individuals on a global scale. So what does it mean to kind of inherit those legacies, but also what are the ways that we can refuse them? And for me, it's sort of like, I don't know, like, I think there are other curators who work in this way, where it's sort of like, we have these histories, we can be in certain spaces, but we don't necessarily feel that we need to engage with them, or we're interested in talking around them or talking beyond them. And I'm going to shout out Kelly Morgan, who is on this call. This is maybe not necessarily directly answering what Natasha has proposed to us, but I was reading an essay that she wrote shortly after she left the Indianapolis Museum of Art in Newfields. And one of the things that she was speaking about, and this goes in relation to the recent controversy around that space, where they, you know, want to maintain their core white audience while diversifying who goes into that space. Kelly mentioned, I don't recall the artist's name, but it was an African-American, it was a Black artist who was showing in that space. And Kelly, and I believe other people in the institution, they did the work in advance of that exhibition taking place there. They went to churches, they went to different community groups, et cetera. And at the opening of that exhibition, they saw, I think, their largest numbers of Black audiences within that space. So I think those are things for us to think about, like, how do we move outside of the space and how do we invite people into the space? And again, thinking about these ideas around binaries, and I apologize if I'm mishearing what people are saying, because I think that when we're talking about, like, curators having politics of radicalism. We don't know whether they do or not, right? There are only so many things you can do inside these spaces. People may be in allegiance to what we understand as being radical. And actually, what does that actually mean, right? What does that actually mean? How are we defining that? What does radicalism look like in the space of the classroom, the university classroom, or in the space of the museum? It's not necessarily something as drastic as what we might understand or expect it to be. But also when we're talking about communities, and this was something that I was thinking about this when Mars was talking about this. There are spaces that I've worked in that are built around this idea of community. And there is this idea of community is something that's homogenous or monolithic, and there are violences that you can still experience within those spaces. So when we're talking about, say, the Black community, that's a term that's often used, and that's not a space that necessarily allows for, broad spans of education, of class, of sexuality, right? And these are all of the things that I think we need to be thinking about, because curators are also members within these outside communities. And it's not that even if you are, whether or not you sort of make a conscious decision, I am going to adhere to the methodologies, the expectations that this institution demands. You don't necessarily abandon all those parts of yourself when you enter into those spaces. So that was just something that I wanted to bring up. And again, when we're talking about artists, and I mentioned artists earlier on, me personally, not to call out artists, but because the work that we do is predicated on the labor of artists. These institutions exist to showcase the work of artists, right? It's not that their artistic production is not being co-opted or misrepresented, et cetera, but they have a lot of power. In some instances, they have more power than curators do, or interpreters, or other types of programmers. And again, if we are making work, a lot of us who belong to various marginalized groups, the work that we are doing is usually informed by our membership in those groups, right? There is a reason why we want to talk about, different racial or ethnic representation, the reasons why we need to acknowledge indigeneity, why we're insisting that within the Americas, right? Why we're talking about ability. So it's disingenuous to be making work around those issues and then to be getting grants or funding because you are a member of these groups, but then not taking that out to the street. And so when we're talking about, yes, I was very impressed by the fact that, I'm going back to the Whitney again, that curators within that institution, they put their livelihoods on the line. They made things uncomfortable for themselves working in that space by signing that letter condemning candors, right? And calling out their institution as well. But when we want to be in, these institutions are working in them. These are conversations we have to have with ourselves. What does it mean when we are adhering to, I guess, the exhibition of certain types of aesthetics, and we contribute to the reproduction of certain types of aesthetics? What does it mean when we are going to showcase, or we want to showcase our work or work in a space that has a history or has a collection that's amassed around stolen artifacts and reproducing misinformation in relation to them? This idea around longevity that goes back to care, which I'm going to go back to, I think, again, I think the way that Harry is speaking and is pulling out all of these sort of attendant issues is very critical. It's very important to be speaking about climate change and what it means to be caring for objects, which often don't see the light of day, right? That's something we should be talking about as well. But when I'm thinking about care and this idea of temporalities, or something that is you are temporarily in engagement with, I think that's a way of kind of showcasing respect that can be replicated on many different levels. So when even the care that it's taking, that can be enacted within repatriating an object, returning an object. I think those are things that are very important to be mindful of moving forward. But I think we can do all of those things in the moment in which we are engaged in dialogue with a practitioner, with a maker, etc. But then also realize that these things are not going to be preserved for posterity. I think that's okay. I don't think those two things are in contradiction with each other. And again, in terms of thinking about artists, I'm going to shout out a couple of artists. They're all based here in Canada. There are people like Shelley Nero and Sandra Brewster and Maria Hupfield, who I've worked with all three of them, but they will exhibit their work in different types of spaces. And I know Sandra Brewster in particular, and I'm kind of talking out of turn here, is someone who is interested in showcasing in different spaces, but doesn't necessarily value an exhibition at a larger type of institution over, say, showcasing in an artist-run center. She will approach them both in the same way, with the same level of respect and care for this opportunity for engagement. And she's also someone who is very invested in, I'm showcasing this work here, these are the kinds of dialogues I'm having here, but what kind of conversations can I be having with communities that exist outside of these spaces? How can we have those conversations with particular residents, both inside and outside of these institutions? And I think that's something that this is kind of what I was thinking of in terms of how Kelly has been working. Kelly Morgan, I'm referring to here. Both, how do I engage with these dialogues, or how do I kind of unleash these dialogues within this space and outside of this space, so that you're kind of moving across these boundaries, however invisible or visible they may be.
Thank you. I want to acknowledge time. It's 1:53. So I don't think we got any questions. And so if not, then we can just wrap up through hearing you all one last time, and then we can have some closing remarks, and then this will feed into the 5th conversation in 2 weeks. So I think Latanya, if you have any thoughts, and then we'll just do one last round.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think it's definitely, I've been thinking a lot about this, what Sally was just talking about, the value of the spaces that we're in relationship to care, this concept of fugitivity. And I was writing down the relationship between fugitivity and care. Like, that's something I felt like maybe that should be just a whole talk about that. So I'm going to just stop there.
Thank you. Awam.
Thank you for this opportunity. And I think for me, it is just that curatorial practices are never finished. They're open-ended questioning processes. And the places we engage our work will challenge us. And the exhibition is not going to be the sole way of changing the world, but it will contribute somewhat. And that permanent act of engagement with the text, with the artist, with the context which produces them, is what actually will make the work an active process rather than a very passive process. And I think the decolonial aspect is also critical, that even as we work in institutions that have colonial histories, etc., our presence is there, are textually decolonial as well, but we have to activate them so that we are in excess of those places. And I think that for me is a kind of from the thing that as curators or as professors or whatever, we just want to show that the place is not enough to cover the broad spectrums of subjectivity that we're looking at, or that we're signaling even by our practices as curators or as artists. So I think that for me, that's where I'll kind of leave it, that it's really a permanent process of inquiry, encounters, criticality, and that we're not supposed to be simply providing stories for the status quo, but we're constantly destabilizing and the status quo and its artifacts. And that energy is what will make the artists also get into the groove of producing works that are not finished, but are open-ended texts with which they want to engage the world.
Harry?
I really just want to say thank you. It's a really brilliant conversation. It's really nice to be talking with you all. to be building relationships together. And I know that I recognize, I think that talking is a form of doing, but I also just want to say that I want to do more of the doing with you all, because I believe there's a really important praxis here that is being discussed in terms of creating care, building other imaginaries and structures. So really excited to continue that work with you all moving forward. So thank you.
Thank you, Sally.
Yeah, I think I was just listening to what other people were saying, and I wasn't thinking about how I was going to summarize this. But yeah, I guess to build on what Harry was saying, that at the end of the day, I feel very fortunate and privileged in some ways that I'm able to engage in a line of work where it is kind of psychologically or emotionally fulfilling and validating and energizing. And through the engagement of art objects, but more with the people who produce them, and having these kinds of conversations and engagements, I find them to be very expansive and validating to the work that we are doing, that it has a value for the people who are attending these spaces and for the people who are working within these spaces, but also the people who are calling us to be accountable, to think about how we are creating work that basically exists as a portal to all of the spaces, i.e. the world that exists around us. And so I think someone made a comment it was more of a comment in the chat section about ethics. I think, there's an ethics of care, an ethics of accountability, an ethics of responsibility that I think all of us who are working within this field need to be mindful of. And I think, again, I'm going to thank the other participants, but for DTP, because these are the ways in which you work. You kind of call us to account, but also move beyond that. You're moving within ethos of care, with an ethos of love, calling us to think beyond how we function within these spaces. So I'll just leave it there. I'm thankful for this.
Yeah, thank you all. I think that, my last thought on this to kind of think about is like, again, it's something that I carry with me from yesterday, but being in front of MoMA and not inside of MoMA was so empowering. Once you find others and once people walk out of the institution and find each other. And then all of a sudden, the type of aesthetics and the ability to breathe in what is beautiful and possible, just the idea, like you can represent care and feeling and all this stuff, or you can just experience it and you try to find the words for it, right? And I think that something that I left yesterday with is that the people that were working in the library and people that were working in the archives, and then the people that were working at the tickets and one of the curators, they all had similar politics and feelings to what we have and the questions we have, but they haven't been able to talk to each other in the same institution, right? So then creating other spaces, both geographically, psychically, spatially, is really important. And I think that the work that we're doing is that we have to find ways in excess, outside of, that can allow us to create other relations. And that's ultimately what'll be unsettling. What we found, my experience has been, because I left thinking MoMA's really at risk. When you're able to be outside and to meet and to organize, you've solved an organizational issue for them. You've created a crisis. And this is the same technologies that they use to divide and control and conquer. They use it with the migrant workers when they put them in the same, in the same camp, unable to speak the same languages from areas that are geographically conflicted around borders, colonial borders. So the work that we can do and that we're doing together is and what we've managed to do because of curators that took risks. That's the other thing, And I think to Awam's point, you know, it was a fluke that we got into artist space, an absolute fluke, because the director was leaving and he didn't tell anyone he was leaving. And he kind of just wanted to leave with a bang or didn't care. Something was going on there that was like, you know, Harry can speak more to it. And then Harry did all the work, you know, but also Harry was there, and, you know, and we, the idea of like curator and artist really dissolved, and we were trying to, and we went in there not with a show, because we didn't do a show, but we went in there thinking, how can we redistribute resources, and how can we create power in a decolonial formation in the city? And if you look at the decolonial manual, that was that journey that resulted in being able to do FTP in the city way outside of the walls of the institution, right? So that doesn't recognize these divides. Thank you all so much. Nit, do you have any last thoughts?
I just wanted to say this was really beautiful. I mean, I feel like, you know, there's care, degrowth, like aesthetics is an open document. So is art should be an open document. I mean, I feel like so much of what we do in our movements is constantly learning and unlearning and moving within the time and space, right? And resisting coloniality through that. So I feel like it all kind of connects together. So it was really nice to hear everybody.
Thank you all, and thanks everyone for coming in. 2 weeks from now, same time, Saturday at 12 Eastern time. Thank you. Thank you all.